Encounter is brought to you by the Broome County Council of Churches, where we connect compassion with needs as we inspire growth with dignity. You'll find us in special places throughout the community. For those who remain hungry, we provide meals. For those who are challenged, we build wheelchair ramps. We comfort those who are ill, minister to those who are confined, and we remain an advocate for change and understanding on behalf of every element of our community. Connect and inspire. Encounter the Broome County Council of Churches.
Good morning and welcome to Encounter. I'm your host today, Joe Sellepack. I say host because to differentiate myself from the other two guests that I have today who are also hosts, but they're not sitting in this chair today. So we're going to be talking. We're going to be talking a little bit today about prophetic ministry and prophetic preaching specifically. And prophetic preaching is one of those interesting topics that comes up whenever you go to a festival of homiletics or you go to various preaching seminars that have to do with how preachers convey truth to their congregations. And one of the things that's important for us to begin talking about as far as prophetic ministry or prophetic preaching is concerned is what that definition actually of prophetic preaching is, because there's a lot out there. So how important is this whole aspect of defining prophetic preaching? Because I mean, we could get into like Hal Lindsey, the late great Planet Earth, or we could listen to any number of other forecasters, and for some that to them is what prophecy is all about. It's like sitting down with that fortune, the ball, the crystal ball, and gazing into it and seeing what the future looks like, and that for them is what prophecy is. Now, is that true? Is that a true understanding of what prophetic preaching or prophetic ministry is all about?
I think you're right. I think when people think of prophecy, they think of the future, but it seems to me that the prophets of the Bible looked at the present and they didn't like what they saw.
Right.
And so they tried to release us from what life was to move us toward God's future. And identifying what the bad news is helps get us to what the good news is. And part of the problem with prophetic preaching is that we're not sure our people want to hear it. It's discomforting.
Yeah.
And we assume people come to church to be comforted and patted on the back and told everything's okay. So every once in a while, however, to preach prophetically, it seems to me, you kind of shake things up a little bit. But I don't have to preach anymore. I'm retired. And actually, I could say anything I want, and people just don't invite me back. Exactly. On the other hand, Mark Kimpland here, an active pastor.
Yes. And I agree. I mean, the prophets were speaking to a certain population, people at a certain time, in a certain place, for certain reasons. But one of the questions that you sent in the email as we were putting this together, prophetic preaching also, I believe, has to be couched with pastoral preaching, mm-hmm. With care and grace and justice and hope and all of those things kind of packaged in together. And it requires, as the prophets did, they spoke to people where they were. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to be there's a grace and a sensitivity that kind of buffers against each other with the truth. Mm-hmm. That all of that is all combined together in the art of preaching.
Yeah, very cool. Well, my guests today, of course, are Jeff Kellam and Mark Kimpland, who are both hosts, and me, because every fifth Sunday. Those of you that have been viewing or listening know that every fifth Sunday we usually do a host Sunday, and this one being a fifth Sunday, we get what we could find. We couldn't get Alicia today, so
because she's out of the country.
Well, of course, she couldn't come back from Israel in order to be here for this event. So. But yeah, when I was thinking about what you were talking about, there are instances within the prophets when you're reading through Isaiah, and you're also reading through Jeremiah too, where it seems like there's a lot of bad news being piled on, and really, I mean, what they're saying is that if we keep on this road, if we keep going down this trajectory, here's the result of what that trajectory is going to look like. But at this crucial moment, if you decide to repent, to change, to do something different, here's the other result that could come, right? So it seems to me like when I'm thinking about prophetic preaching, Mark, the issue is, like you said, you have to be gracious. You also have to be pastoral in the middle of the prophetic preaching. It's to understand how difficult this present moment is for everybody, and then being able to give them the good news of that future, whatever that future happens to be. And oftentimes when I'm listening to a sermon, and I listen to a lot of sermons. That's one of the greatest things about being the executive director at the Broome County Council of Churches is the fact that
it's a positive thing. In other words,
yeah, it is a positive thing. Is that I get to listen to preaching, and I get to listen to the type of preaching that, and to see the interaction between a pastor and his or her congregation, which is it's tender at times. But then there are also times when it's full of conflict too, and even in the midst of conflict, there has to be some grace spelled out. So I don't think like that. When I was going through my doctoral work, I did at Colgate Rochester Crozer, and they were big into prophetic stuff, and they were saying, well, why is everybody pastoral? Why are you giving pastoral sermons all the time and not being prophetic? And the thing is, I don't think that you can do one without the other. They're not. It's not like this one is prophetic and this one is pastoral.
Yes.
You can't be pastoral. You can't care for people without also being prophetic, because you understand where they're going, where they're headed, and being able to use the rod in the right way, or being able to give them direction or support in the way that the situation at the moment requires. So how do we do that for our people? I mean, that's really the question for the ministry, the minister, right? So how do we be that presence?
I mean, I kind of know how not to.
Right.
I mean, because it's easy to go third person.
Right.
Jeremiah says this, Isaiah says this, and don't flush anything out as to what that means to Mr. and Mrs. Jones, who are struggling to put food on the table, and a myriad of things that they have going on in their lives, and to see themselves in that picture. One of the things, because I'm also a firm believer that there are still prophetic voices among us.
Right.
Constantly, not just in Scripture. There are still prophetic voices out there, and I was thinking about this as I was on my way here. I've said a phrase for 30 years plus at every funeral, and I'll tell you what I say, which I think's prophetic and pastoral, but then the response to it. I talk about finding peace in the midst of this time, and one of the ways in which we find that peace is through God's promise of everlasting life, that gift. And this is the phrase I say: I don't stand before you arrogant enough or ignorant enough to tell you I got that all figured out. And nowhere do I see in Scripture it says figure it out.
Right.
But it says countless times, trust in the one that does have it figured out. Every time, and I can say this, almost every time, when I get to that point that I'm not arrogant enough or ignorant enough to tell you I got it all figured out, whether the people are churched or unchurched, it's as if a weight had been lifted from the room.
Yeah.
Right.
There's head nods, and whew, like wow.
Shoulders.
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean, every single time. And so the idea of just relying on the prophets for a prophetic voice, I think now is our responsibility to do that with grace, but to do it with intentionality.
Yeah.
Intentionality, I think, is where I try to heighten the awareness of that with both.
Yeah.
Right.
Certainly, we could talk about the prophetic preachers that we have heard,
Right.
known, and for me, it was William Sloane Coffin Jr.,
Oh, yeah.
who didn't make any fans among
Right.
folks who disagreed with his stand
Yep.
during the Vietnam War or about race relations. He was the pastor, after a while, of the Riverside Church.
Yeah.
And so, but at the same time, while he railed against power and against the kingdoms of the earth, rather than in supporting the kingdom of heaven, he also had a pastoral side. His son died in an accident,
Yeah.
and to hear him talk about that, you realize there are the pastoral and the prophetic tied together in
Exactly.
that one man. But I've read his sermons, I've read his prayers, and I'm touched by his conscience, but also by the love that he had for his flock.
Yeah.
And not only his flock, but his flock, especially during the Vietnam War, was headlines. I mean, the people who read about him, about everything from burning your draft cards. But at the same time, as he moved through his ministry and became a pastor of a church, again, I think he was probably the most blatant example of what it means to be a prophetic preacher today.
Right.
And it's not just, we could name the topics, homosexuality, gun violence, go through all the topics that are the ones that make our congregations uncomfortable. People will rail against it if we say this is what Jesus would have done. They may disagree with that. But I think as we get to know our people and our congregations, the folks in the pews, the folks who are going to work every day, the folks who can't find work every day, then you realize that there are more than just these hot button issues.
When I hear prophetic ministry or prophetic preaching being described at times, it's all, like I said, it's along this trajectory. We're going to get to this point, and then if we continue this way, it's going to lead to perdition. It's basically what they're saying. And if you choose, here's what the future could look like. The other thing that I think is really interesting about prophetic preaching is that not only is it about the future, but it's also something about the past. So it brings in the radical nature of faith. Where in terms of, not necessarily in terms of how progressive we can be, but how rooted we can be. Mm-hmm. Because it's calling us back to the roots. It's kind of saying, this is what our faith is. And you can't be in faith and do that. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's a different way of approaching it. And so like the rootedness I think of at times is more like what, like Martin Luther King, when he's going through I have the dream speech, right? And he gets to the point where he starts talking about it, let freedom ring. Yeah. Let freedom ring. Now, what, as an American, what does that let freedom ring draw to your mind? Yeah. It's some of our founding music. It's the founding documents. Mm-hmm. It's the Liberty Bell. It's the, let freedom ring. It's like we know what that is, and because of that, he's reinterpreting our past in light of the experience of people who haven't experienced freedom in the same way that the founders did. Yeah. And then he's pointing us in a different direction. So he's reinterpreting our document for us. He's saying, if you're going to live with freedom, it better say something to these people too. Mm-hmm. So how to like the best, in terms of that, then isn't the isn't the message of the prophets something of a contextualized message? It's saying to certain people, look, there's going to be a change in your life. And then to other people, well, yeah, you're going to have to come up to the plate too. And then to other people, well, we're going to lift you up. So it's kind of like, and by the way, for those people who think that they're on the top, there's a cost to that too, right? There's a cost to being on the top. So just wait until the moment you have experienced what these people have experienced. Then you're going to be all messed up, right?
There's a prophetic message. The first shall be last, the last shall be first.
Right.
The reversal, the grand reversal. I said William Sloane Coffin was, think of Jesus as a prophetic preacher. Look at the Beatitudes. Yeah. Blessed are these because this is the future. And then you look at Matthew 25, blessed are those who are the sheep and not the goats. And so you think, well, in what way am I a goat? And I can see very clearly, if I don't feed the hungry, if I don't visit those in prison or the sick, then I realize now that that's a prophetic utterance.
Yeah.
It's not just happy gospel stuff. It's prophetic.
And even then, at some point in my life, I've been hungry. At some point in my life, I've been naked. And I've been in the hospital laid up on my back without anybody to visit me. Mm-hmm. You know, there have been times when I have been there. And I think that, you know, most of our audience will understand that too, right? Because they've been there. They understand that it's not always easy.
Yeah.
And when our eyes get turned toward the people who are suffering, you know, it's not done out of malice when it's done in the right way, like what we were talking about. It's done out of love. Mm-hmm. We need to communicate that. I think even in the midst of the prophetic call, you know, there is, like in Isaiah, comfort. You know, that huge comfort, oh comfort my people, and you know, and there are these sweeping poems of beauty and grandeur and love that are part of the prophetic understanding too. And I get sometimes, you know, that we need to be prophetic, but we also need to remember that it has to be couched in beauty and in love too.
Yeah, and I think the present day challenge also, Dr. Phil Wagaman was my voice from Wesley. I had him as a professor several times, and I was always struck by, he would speak about the nuances of prophetic preaching, especially in today's time.
Right.
You know, where such diversity, such a diversity of wisdom and understanding, that there are nuances in that truth.
Right.
And uncovering those, and he was gifted at that, like the issue of justice. That may mean something totally different from one person to another, and to explore that, to go down that rabbit hole, to find out what other things are we not getting, or what are we missing in this call of prophetic preaching. And that's especially in the internet age now. Right. That is more of a challenge than ever.
Yeah. And one of my guests today are Mark Kimpland and Jeff Kellam, and we're talking about prophetic ministry and prophetic preaching. One of the things that I think is pretty interesting when I'm listening to a sermon is when I feel uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And it brings and I don't think that feeling so let's get to the thing about discomfort. What is the role of discomfort within a person as far as spiritual growth is concerned? Is it always about comfort, or should we at times feel discomfort in the middle of worship service?
Well, when I think about prophetic preaching about the topics that are hot button topics, if someone is feeling uncomfortable because they've heard the gospel,
right?
They've heard what the kingdom of love and justice and mercy are all about. That's one thing, but if I'm shading it and trying to be really nice about it in order that they don't reduce their pledge or change churches, because that's what often keeps a pastor from being honest about the gospel and about the radical nature of this love that Jesus preached. We're afraid we're going to lose people.
Right.
We're going to lose income. We won't be able to do this. That's the wrong kind of discomfort, I think.
Right.
I wanted to reverse the question and ask you when you've been discomforted by preaching.
So it's interesting to me, you read, before we started this show, you read that quote from Bert Brueggemann about being the obdurate nature of people.
Yeah.
And the thing is...
And I have to admit, I had to look up obdurate.
Right. Well, the thing is that according, and as I get older, the more obdurate I become. I am steadfast, and I become, connected to this trajectory of my life, and I get comfortable in it.
Yeah.
So the obdurate nature of me is called into question repeatedly, when I go into worship, because at times I need to hear, that I need to grow, even as I get older. It's the growth. That growth is important.
Yeah, and as you are unpacking that, being uncomfortable, somehow the word enlightenment, it connects with that, because there's one way to be a prophetic preacher and point out the ills, but how does that lead to enlightenment, to maturity, to figuring this out for themselves, rather than just being convicted?
Right.
Because that's a conviction, that's the uncomfortable. But if we leave it there, have we really been prophetic?
Right.
If it doesn't lead to renewal and regeneration and all of these things.
Right. So the question is, so what then?
Yeah.
What difference does this make?
Yeah, I've heard that 5 times. Last week.
I need to know, but I need to know where I'm headed.
Yes.
Right.
And how, and maybe some how-tos, or I think they know why. That's you need to do this, but again, it needs to be more nuanced. I think, in order to lead to revelation for us, and epiphanies and all that.
I was looking back as we were thinking about the topic. I was thinking, all right, Kellam, when did you preach a prophetic sermon?
Yeah.
And one of the ones that came to mind, because I'm sure there was more than one, when Matthew Shepard was crucified on that barbed wire fence.
Yeah.
At his funeral, those folks from that very conservative
Baptist
church with their signs and their placards with the terrible language, and they were pictured across the street from the church where this thing was going on. So in my sermon, I talked about that, and I talked about this young gay man killed, and I talked about
drugged to death.
When we have his funeral, and his mother is sitting in that front pew, where are you going to sit? Where am I going to sit? Where is Jesus going to sit? Is he going to be across the street with a placard calling him names? Or is Jesus going to come up the aisle and sit in the front row with his mother?
Yeah.
And where am I going to sit? In the back row, so that nobody thinks I'm like him, or I'm a fan, or am I going to sit up there with Jesus and Matthew Shepard's mother and offer the words of comfort that Jesus did? Even as Jesus preached prophetically, he still loved all those people.
He did.
So I thought that's to me, it's preaching compassion and understanding, as well as justice at the same time.
And the nuance then becomes that person hearing you say that in the pew, beginning to identify those people in their lives that they need to sit with and to be grace with.
Beyond that issue, quote unquote, to now who are the outcasts that Jesus was with.
Yeah.
And who are the outcasts that are with me right now? Or where is the outcast in me right now?
Yeah.
And
Because
all of that.
And how do
Yeah.
I bring that outcast in?
And how do how do I show grace?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do I show grace in the midst of that? And that, I think that to me is the crux to the matter.
Yes. Because without that, I'm not sure it's prophetic preaching.
Well, it's not. And you can read through like Ezekiel 34, one of my favorite passages about shepherding, where it's where the shepherds are out and and they're not doing their job, and Ezekiel basically says, has God saying, I'm tired of watching the shepherds fleece their flocks.
Yeah.
And they're eating off of the fat of the lamb. They're taking the wool off of them for their own clothing, and they're not doing their job. I will be the shepherd for these. And then the invitation comes, won't you help me in shepherding my flock?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then they understand, well, this is what where we're called to go is with God into ministry.
Yes.
In the midst of God's flock. We are called to be with God in this. God isn't just some removed person who's watching all of this stuff happen. God is in the midst of all of this.
A quick note about what you say. Say that again about the funeral. What do you say at the funeral?
I don't stand before you arrogant enough or ignorant enough to tell you that I've got this all figured out.
And so, sometimes asking the right questions
Yes.
Right.
is prophetic.
Yes.
It is.
Rather than proclaiming
Yes.
and wagging the finger.
Yes, yes.
Asking the questions so that folks, when they go home in the car, can think, well, they can talk to one another and say, what do you think?
Yeah,
You know?
absolutely.
And that
Yes.
to me is what Fred Craddock, great preacher, amazing preacher. I loved listening to Fred. I almost liked him as much as Jim Forbes. Loved Jim Forbes too. But Fred Craddock said, we answer too many questions in our preaching. We need to ask, have you ever left your congregation with a question?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so he would leave, he would stop his sermons in the middle of a question and go, that's it. Have at it. And then the coffee hour would be different.
Yes.
In that
Yeah.
given.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yes.
so we're coming to the end. I need
glad
to
we solved
thank
that.
I need to thank our guests, Jeff Kellam and Mark Kimpland, for being on Encounter today and for us talking about prophetic preaching.
And how I wish Alicia had been
Yes.
here.
And how
Yes.
That'd be another
Alicia
voice.
would have
Yeah.
been
No
a
doubt.
great voice to have
No
with
doubt,
us.
no doubt.
And
Yes.
for all of you, I'm going to say what Jeff Kellam usually says: be kind to each other.
Amen.